My wife, the boss, called me into her office with a smirk. John, you'll be training your replacement. After 10 years, you will be joining the board of directors. I nodded calmly. Of course. She had no idea that 3 weeks ago, I saw her email on her plans to fire me once I'm done training her new boyfriend. So I secretly bought the company? Tomorrow would be interesting. The rain started at exactly 2:47 p.m. I know because I was staring at my watch when Margaret's assistant, Dana, appeared at my cubicle door with that particular expression, the one that says, I know something you don't, and I'm professionally obligated to pretend I don't know it. The sky outside had been threatening all morning, those low gray clouds that hang over the city like a held breath. And when the first drops hit the window beside my desk, I thought, of course, even the weather knows. John, Dana said, her voice carefully neutral, professionally pleasant in that way that makes your stomach drop. Margaret would like to see you in her office. I looked up from the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing, numbers I'd spent a decade learning to read like poetry, patterns and trends that told stories most people missed, and I smiled at her. Not the tight, nervous smile of a man about to be ambushed. A real smile, calm, maybe even a little amused. Of course, Wendon said, give me just a moment to save this. Dana lingered, uncertain. She was used to seeing fear in the eyes of people summoned to the executive suite. The previous month, she'd called Marcus Chen to Margaret's office, and he'd actually knocked over his coffee in his haste to respond, leaving a spreading brown stain across his expense reports like a prophecy. Marcus had been with the company for 7 years. He'd trained his replacement in 2 weeks and was escorted out by security on a Friday afternoon, his family photos hastily stuffed into a cardboard box that read fragile on the side, a word that seemed to apply more to his dignity than the contents. But I wasn't Marcus Chen. I saved my work with deliberate slowness, closed each file with the methodical care of a man who had nothing to fear, and stood up. My suit jacket hung on the back of my chair. A good suit, Italian, the kind Margaret had once complimented me on during our engagement party 10 years ago, when she'd still looked at me like I was someone worth complimenting. I slipped it on and buttoned it carefully. Ready? I said to Dana. The walk to Margaret's office took us through the main floor of Harrison & Cole Financial Services, past rows of cubicles where people hunched over computers like penitents at prayer, through the analysis department where younger versions of myself crunched numbers and dreamed of corner offices, past the break room where someone had burned popcorn again, that acrid smell that would linger for hours like a small domestic tragedy. I'd made this walk 1,000 times, 10 years of walking these halls, first as a junior analyst fresh out of business school, then as a senior analyst, then as director of financial planning, then as Margaret's husband, then as Margaret's employee husband, and finally for the past 3 weeks, as a man who knew exactly what was coming and had spent every single day preparing for it with the patience of someone planning a very specific kind of resurrection. Margaret's office occupied the southwest corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the river cutting through it like a silver scar. On clear days, you could see all the way to the harbor. Today, the rain blurred everything into impressionist smudges of gray and darker gray, buildings dissolving into clouds, the whole world reduced to watercolor uncertainty. Dana knocked, 2 soft raps that sounded apologetic, and opened the door without waiting for a response. John's here, she announced, then disappeared like smoke. Margaret sat behind her desk, that massive mahogany monument to success that had cost more than most people's cars. She was beautiful in that careful, expensive way that money and discipline create, highlighted hair styled with mathematical precision, makeup applied with artistic exactitude, a navy suit that probably cost what I used to make in a month back when I was starting out. 42 years old and fighting time to a draw with personal trainers and dermatologists and the kind of controlled diet that treats food as fuel rather than pleasure. She was smiling, not a warm smile. Margaret didn't do warm anymore, hadn't for years. This was the smile she used in board meetings when she was about to deliver bad news disguised as good news. The smile that said, I'm about to do something you won't like, and I'm going to enjoy watching you pretend to be okay with it. John, she said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from her desk. Sit down. I sat, crossed my legs, met her eyes with the calm of a man who'd spent 3 weeks rehearsing this exact moment in his mind, playing out every possible variation until I knew my part perfectly. "How are the Q3 projections looking?" she asked, and I recognized the preamble, the small talk before the knife. We'd been married long enough that I knew her rhythms, her patterns, the way she circled before striking. "Strong," I said. "We're tracking about 7% above forecast. The Hendrix merger is performing better than expected, and the new Asian markets are opening up exactly as we projected." "We," she said, and there was something in her voice, a slight emphasis that felt like a correction. "You mean the company?" "Of course," I said. "The company." She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled in that gesture that meant she was about to say something she'd rehearsed, something she thought was clever. Outside, the rain intensified, drops striking the window like small accusations. "John, you've been with Harrison and Cole for 10 years now." "10 years next month," I said. "October 15th. "A decade," she continued, and I could hear the speech unspooling, the words she'd prepared. "That's a significant milestone. You've given this company a tremendous amount. Your work on the Hendrix merger alone saved us." "What would you estimate?" "Approximately 43 million in potential losses," I said. "Plus we identified an additional 17 million in unrealized assets." 60 million, she said, and shook her head like I just told her I'd found $60 million in the couch cushions. "That's remarkable, John, truly. The board has been very impressed with your performance." Here it comes, I thought. I kept my face neutral, receptive, the expression of a man who believes he's about to receive good news. "Which is why," Margaret said, and her smile widened just slightly, "we've decided to promote you." I blinked, waited, let the silence stretch just long enough to seem like genuine surprise. "Promote me," I repeated. "To the board of directors," she said, and I had to admire the performance, I really did. The way she delivered the line with just enough enthusiasm to seem genuine, just enough restraint to seem professional. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't seen the email 3 weeks ago, I might have actually believed her. Might have. "Margaret, I said slowly, That's, that's incredible. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet," she said, leaning forward now, elbows on the desk. And I noticed she was wearing the diamond bracelet I'd bought her for our 5th anniversary, back when I still believed our marriage was something worth celebrating with expensive gestures. "There's a transition period, of course. We need to ensure continuity in your current role." "Of course," I said, which means, and here came the smirk, that little curl at the corner of her mouth that she probably thought was subtle, "you'll need to train your replacement." I nodded slowly as if considering the logistics. "That makes sense. How long are we talking? 2 months? 3? "We were thinking 6 weeks," she said. "We want to make sure the transition is smooth. This is a critical role and we can't afford any disruption." 6 weeks. I did the math in my head, not the math she thought I was doing, calculating when I'd be free of my current responsibilities and ascending to the rarefied air of the boardroom. No, I was doing different math entirely. 6 weeks from today would be November 26th, just after Thanksgiving. The perfect time to fire someone right before the holidays, when they'd be too distracted by family obligations to immediately lawyer up, when the job market would be slow, when they'd spend Christmas and New Year's unemployed and desperate. I'd seen this movie before. Marcus Chen, Linda Washington before him, Robert Torres before her, all fired right around the holidays, all after training their replacements. All with promises of promotions that evaporated like morning fog. 6 weeks, I said. That seems reasonable. "I'm glad you think so," Margaret said. "Your replacement will be starting Monday. I'd like you to spend the week getting him up to speed on our systems, our clients, our procedures. You know the drill." "Him," I said, as if I was just noticing the pronoun. "Yes," she said, and now the smirk was unmistakable, a crack in the professional facade revealing something uglier underneath. "Connor Page. He's coming over from Morrison and Associates. Very talented, very hungry. I think you'll like him." Connor Page. I kept my face blank, but inside, Something cold and precise clicked into place like a tumbler in a lock. Because I knew that name. I'd known it for 3 weeks, ever since I'd seen the email chain on Margaret's laptop. The one she'd left open when she'd gone to the kitchen to refill her wine glass during one of our increasingly silent dinners at home. From Margaret Harrison to Connor Page. Subject, your position. Connor, everything is proceeding as planned. I'll have him train you for 6 weeks, then we'll transition him out. He suspects nothing. Too trusting, too comfortable. After 10 years, he thinks he's indispensable. He's not. The board position was a nice touch, don't you think? He'll believe it right up until security is escorting him out. By then, you'll be fully trained and we can finally work together without him hovering. Can't wait for our trip to the Maldives to celebrate. I'd read that email 3 times, standing in my own kitchen with my wife's laptop glowing in front of me like a confession. Then I'd read the rest of the thread. Weeks of messages between Margaret and Connor, a relationship that had apparently started 6 months ago at some financial conference in Chicago and had progressed from professional admiration to flirtation to full-blown affair with remarkable speed. Can't wait to finally be free of him, she'd written in one message. He's been dead weight for years. And in another, once he's gone, we can really build something together. The company, us, everything. I'd stood there in that kitchen, our kitchen, in the house we'd bought together, filled with furniture we'd chosen and artwork we'd collected and memories we'd made. And I'd felt something shift inside me. Not rage, exactly. Rage was too hot, too chaotic, too uncontrolled. This was colder, clearer, more focused. I'd closed the laptop carefully. Finished cooking dinner, served Margaret her pasta with pesto and pine nuts, exactly the way she liked it. We'd eaten in near silence, the television murmuring in the background, and when she'd asked me if something was wrong, I'd smiled and said, "Just tired, long day." And then I'd started planning. Now, sitting in her office with rain streaking the windows behind her and that smirk on her face, I channeled every ounce of discipline I possessed into maintaining my expression of pleased surprise. "Connor Page," I said, "I've heard good things." "He's excellent," Margaret said. And there was something in her voice now, a warmth that never appeared when she talked about me anymore. "Very sharp, very dedicated. I think under your guidance, he'll be a tremendous asset to the company." Under your guidance. The irony was almost funny. I was supposed to train my wife's boyfriend to take my job so she could fire me and run off into the sunset with him, all while believing I was being promoted to the board. "When do I meet him?" I asked. "Monday morning, 9 a.m., she said. "I thought we could all have breakfast together. You, me, Connor. Start building that rapport." Breakfast, the 3 of us. I imagined it. Margaret smiling between her husband and her lover, orchestrating our interaction like a conductor, watching me shake hands with the man who was sleeping with my wife while training him to erase me from the company it had helped build. "That sounds great," I said, and I meant it, because by Monday morning, certain other things would have happened, certain pieces would be in motion, and that breakfast would be a very different kind of meal than Margaret was imagining. "Excellent," she said, standing up, the universal signal that the meeting was over. "I knew you'd be professionous about this, John. That's always been one of your strengths. You're a team player." "A team player." I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and smiled at my wife. "I try," I said. She walked around the desk and did something that surprised me. She hugged me. Brief, professional, the kind of hug you'd give a colleague, but still. Her perfume was different than it used to be, something more expensive and less familiar, and I wondered if Connor had given it to her. "This is going to be good for you," she said, pulling back and looking at me with what might have been genuine concern if I didn't know better. "The board position, I mean. You've been stuck in operations for too long. You deserve to move up." "Thank you," I said. That means a lot. And it did mean a lot in a way. It meant she still thought I was a fool. It meant she had no idea what was coming. It meant every assumption she'd made about me, that I was too trusting, too comfortable, too domesticated to fight back, was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. I left her office and walked back through the halls of Harrison and Cole, past the same cubicles, the same break room with its lingering popcorn smell, the same people who had no idea that their world was about to shift on its axis. Dana was at her desk and she gave me a sympathetic look. The kind you give someone who just got bad news disguised as good news. And I smiled at her too. Back at my desk, I sat down and stared at my computer screen for a long moment. The rain was really coming down now, sheets of it washing across the windows. The city beyond dissolving into gray chaos. I opened my email and composed a new message. To Richard Chen, Chen and Associates Legal. From John Harrison. Subject, REPA, final documents. Richard, everything is proceeding exactly as discussed. The acquisition closes tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please ensure all documentation is finalized and ready for execution. I want this to be completely airtight. Also, can you be at the office Monday morning at 9 a.m.? I think your presence at the introductory breakfast would be beneficial. Best, John. I hit send and sat back in my chair. 3 weeks ago, I discovered my wife was planning to destroy me. So I'd spent those 3 weeks doing something she never expected. Something so audacious and so perfectly calculated that even now, with all the pieces in place, it almost didn't seem real. I'd bought the company. Not just a few shares, not a minority stake. The whole thing, Harrison & Cole Financial Services, all of it, acquired through a web of shell companies and legal structures so complex that even Margaret, who thought she understood finance, would need weeks to unravel it, if she ever got the chance. The acquisition had been expensive, liquidating my trust fund, the inheritance from my grandfather that I'd been carefully growing for 20 years, taking out loans secured against assets Margaret didn't know I had, calling in favors from old business school friends who'd gone into private equity and venture capital. It had been complicated, requiring lawyers and accountants and bankers who specialized in discrete transactions, the kind of people who understood that sometimes you need to buy something in absolute secret. But it had been possible, and tomorrow at 2 p.m. it would be complete. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. I would become the owner of Harrison & Cole Financial Services. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. everything would change. I looked at the quarterly reports on my screen, all those numbers and projections and careful analyses, and I thought about Monday morning. Thought about that breakfast Margaret had planned, the three of us sitting around a table, Connor Page shaking my hand while Margaret smiled her secret smile, both of them believing they were so clever, so careful, so perfectly positioned. I thought about the moment when I would introduce them to Richard Chen, my lawyer. The moment when I would explain that there had been a small change in the company's ownership structure. The moment when I would watch Margaret's face as she realized what I'd done. The moment when I would finally stop being the fool she thought I was. Outside lightning flashed, brief and brilliant, illuminating the office in stark white light. Thunder followed, a low rumble that shook the windows. The storm was just beginning. The thing about revenge is that it requires more patience than love ever did. I discovered this truth on a Wednesday night 3 weeks ago, standing in my kitchen with Margaret's laptop open in front of me, reading words that rearranged my entire understanding of my life. You'd think the moment you discover your wife is cheating on you, planning to fire you, actively conspiring to destroy your career while pretending to promote you. You'd think that moment would be explosive, volcanic, that you'd smash things, scream, confront her immediately with all the righteous fury of the betrayed. But I didn't do any of that. Instead, I made dinner. I stood there in that kitchen, the laptop screen glowing with evidence of my wife's affair and my impending professional execution, and I thought about pasta. Penne specifically. Margaret liked penne with pesto, pine nuts, a squeeze of lemon. It was one of the first meals I'd ever cooked for her, back when we were dating, back when she was a rising star at Morrison & Associates and I was finishing my MBA at Columbia, both of us young and ambitious and convinced we were going to conquer the world together. Together, I'd believed in that word once, believed it meant something, but standing there reading her emails to Connor Page, can't wait to be free of him. He's been dead weight for years. I realized that Margaret had stopped believing in together a long time ago. Probably around the time she made partner and I was still grinding away in middle management. Probably around the time she realized she'd married someone who was professionally useful but romantically obsolete. A man who knew how to read financial statements, but had somehow forgotten how to read his own wife. Or maybe she'd never believed in it at all. Maybe I'd just been convenient. a talented analyst she could keep close, someone who'd work late and solve problems and ask for nothing more than the occasional compliment and the illusion of partnership. A business decision dressed up in a wedding dress. I closed the laptop carefully, washed my hands, started cooking. Garlic and olive oil, that sharp sizzle and immediate perfume. Basil from the plant on the windowsill, I crushed it between my fingers, and the smell was summer distilled into green. Pine nuts toasting in a dry pan until they were golden and fragrant. Pasta water salting, boiling, penne tumbling in like small surrenders. Margaret came home while I was reducing the pan sauce, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors in the rhythm I'd learned to recognize over 10 years of marriage. She dropped her bag by the door, shrugged out of her coat, called out, "Something smells good," without much interest in her voice. The tone of someone acknowledging a pleasant fact without caring about it. We ate at the dining room table, the good one we'd bought from that furniture maker in Vermont during our 5th anniversary trip. Back when we still took anniversary trips to places other than separate hotels at different conferences, the television was on, some news program murmuring about economic indicators and political scandals, and we chewed our pasta and sipped our wine and existed in the same space without actually being together at all. "Long day?" I asked, because someone had to say something. "Board meeting ran late," she said. "Quarterly review." The usual. I wondered if Connor Page had been at that meeting. Wondered if they'd found some excuse to slip away together, some conference room or empty office where they could pretend their affair was romantic instead of just efficiently cruel. "How did it go?" I asked. "Fine," she said. "Better than expected, actually. We're positioning well for the next fiscal year." We. She said we when talking about the company, but the we of our marriage had evaporated somewhere along the way, condensed into habit and convenience and shared mortgage payments. "That's great," I said. She looked at me across the table, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe concern, maybe just indigestion from eating too fast. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You seem quiet." "Just tired," that's what I said. Which was true. I was tired. Tired of being seen as dead weight. Tired of being the useful husband who knew his place. Tired of being the kind of man someone could betray with a smirk and a promotion to a board position that didn't exist. But mostly I was tired of being underestimated. "You should get some rest," she said, and returned to her pasta, the moment of almost connection evaporating like steam. I finished my wine and thought about what I was going to do. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up at 5 a.m. with perfect clarity. Margaret was still asleep, or pretending to be, facing away from me in our king-size bed with enough space between us to park a small car. I got up quietly, showered, dressed in the dark, and left the house before sunrise. The city was still sleeping, that brief window when the streets belonged to joggers and delivery trucks, and people who've decided to stop sleeping entirely. I drove to the office but didn't go inside. Instead, I sat in my car in the parking garage, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I made a list. Not a mental list, an actual list, pen and paper, the kind of careful documentation that leaves a trail and creates accountability. Because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. What I know. Margaret is having an affair with Connor Page. She plans to have me train him for 6 weeks. She plans to fire me immediately after training is complete. She plans to promote Connor to my position. She's promised me a board position as misdirection. She believes I suspect nothing. What I need: complete discretion, significant capital, expert legal counsel, impeccable timing, evidence for leverage if needed, absolute confidence in my plan. What I have: trust fund from grandfather, 4.82 M. Current value: personal savings, 380K. Investment portfolio, 1.1 M. Equity in our house, 650K. My contribution to down payment. 10 years of institutional knowledge about Harrison & Cole. No moral qualms about using all of the above. I stared at that last item for a long time. The moral qualms thing. Because 3 weeks ago, I would have had moral qualms. 3 weeks ago, I would have confronted Margaret directly, maybe suggested marriage counseling, tried to salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship, because that's what you do when you've invested 10 years in another person. But that was before I read her emails, before I saw the casual cruelty in phrases like dead weight and finally be free of him. For I understood that to her, I wasn't a partner or a husband or even a human being with feelings. I was an obstacle, a problem to be managed and then eliminated. So no moral qualms. I called Richard Chen at 6:15 a.m. He answered on the second ring, sounding alert despite the hour. "John," he said, "everything okay?" Richard and I had gone to Columbia together, studied until 3 a.m. in the library, suffered through the same brutal corporate finance professor, celebrated our graduations at the same dive bar in Morningside Heights. He'd gone into corporate law. I'd gone into financial analysis. We'd stayed in touch, gotten together for beers a few times a year, sent Christmas cards with increasingly elaborate family photos as we'd gotten older and more successful. But we'd never been the kind of friends who called each other at 6:15 in the morning. "I need your help," I said, "and I need absolute confidentiality." There was a pause. I could hear Richard shifting, probably sitting up in bed, his lawyer brain engaging. "Attorney-client privilege?" he asked. "If possible." "What's going on?" I told him. Not everything. Not the emotional devastation or the rage or the nights I'd spent lying awake next to Margaret, wondering when she'd stop loving me and started planning my destruction. Just the facts, the affair, the plan to fire me, the fake board promotion, Connor Page starting Monday. Richard was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Jesus, John," he finally said, "I'm sorry." "I don't need sorry," I said. "I need a plan." "What kind of plan?" "The kind that prevents this from happening. The kind that puts me in control instead of being the victim." Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear Richard's mind working through possibilities, legal strategies, risk assessments. "There are a few approaches," he said carefully. "You could file for divorce, get ahead of this, document the affair, protect your assets. You could go to the board directly, report the relationship. Most companies have policies about executives dating subordinates. And if Connor is going to be working under Margaret's supervision, that's a clear conflict of interest. You could—" "I want to buy the company," I said. Silence. "Richard? You want to what?" "Buy the company, Harrison and Cole, all of it." "John, do you have any idea how much that would cost? What the valuation on Harrison and Cole would be?" "I've done the math," I said. "Revenue last year was $187 million. Net profit about $31 million. Industry standard valuation would be somewhere between 5 and 7 times net profit. So we're talking $155 to $217 million. But Harrison and Cole is privately held, family owned by the Harrison family. Margaret's great-grandfather started it in 1952. Margaret owns 60% through inheritance and stock options. The remaining 40% is split between 12 different shareholders, most of them passive investors or descendants of original partners." Richard was quiet, and I could tell he was Googling, checking my numbers. "That's actually correct," he said. "How did you know it's all that?" "I'm the director of financial planning," I said. "I know everything about this company's finances, including the fact that 3 of the major minority shareholders have been trying to liquidate their positions for the past 2 years, but can't find buyers because Margaret won't approve the sale. She wants to maintain control, including the fact that the company's value is probably closer to the low end of that range because we've been underperforming our sector due to some questionable strategic decisions Margaret has made, including the fact that if someone came in with a serious offer, enough to buy out the minority shareholders and make Margaret an offer for her 60%, she'd have a fiduciary duty to at least consider it. Even if that someone is her husband who she's planning to fire? Especially then," I said, "because she won't see it coming. She thinks I'm broke. She thinks I'm dependent on my salary and her goodwill. She has no idea about my trust fund. My grandfather set it up before we got married, and I've kept it completely separate, never mentioned it, never touched it except to let it grow. She doesn't know about my personal investments. She thinks I'm just middle management with middle management money." "How much do you actually have?" "Liquid and semi-liquid? About 6 million, maybe a bit more if I liquidate everything, which obviously isn't enough to buy the company outright, but it's enough to start. Enough to approach the minority shareholders and make them offers they can't refuse. Enough to get leverage. And then what? Richard asked. Even if you buy out the minorities, Margaret still owns 60%. You can't force her to sell. I don't need to force her, I said. I need to make her want to sell. Or better yet, I need to make it impossible for her to refuse. John, what exactly are you planning? I looked out the windshield at the parking garage, concrete pillars and fluorescent lights, and the shadowy shapes of other people's cars. I'm planning to buy this company out from under my wife before she fires me, I said. I'm planning to do it quietly, quickly, and completely legally. And then on Monday morning, when she introduces me to her boyfriend and expects me to start training my replacement, I'm planning to own the place. I'm planning to be his boss, her boss, everyone's boss. That's, Richard trailed off, crazy? I was going to say ambitious, possibly impossible, definitely expensive. Can you help me? Another long pause. I could hear voices in the background now. Richard's wife asking who he was talking to, morning sounds of a family waking up. I'll need to see everything, Richard said finally. Your assets, the company's financials, the ownership structure, everything. And John, this is going to be complicated, really complicated. We're talking about setting up acquisition vehicles, navigating securities regulations, potentially dealing with SEC filings if the company has any public debt, making sure every single detail is airtight, because if Margaret finds out what you're doing before it's complete, she won't, I said. You sound very confident. I am. She thinks I'm stupid. She thinks I'm weak. She thinks I'm so grateful for her attention that I'd never see this coming, never fight back. She's wrong. Richard sighed, and I could hear him making a decision. Okay, he said, meet me at my office at 8 a.m. Bring everything. And John, be absolutely sure about this. Because once we make the first move, there's no going back. I'm sure, I said, and I was. That Thursday was the longest day of my life, and simultaneously the fastest. Richard's office was in Midtown, glass and steel, and the kind of expensive minimalism that screamed, we are very good at what we do, and we charge accordingly. I showed up at 8 a.m. with a briefcase full of documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, trust fund documentation, tax returns going back 7 years. The complete financial history of a life Margaret thought she understood, but actually knew nothing about. Richard had assembled a team, not just himself, but 2 other lawyers from his firm who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, plus an accountant who'd worked on some of the biggest corporate deals in the city. They sat around a conference table and looked at me like I was either crazy or brilliant, and they weren't sure which. Let's start with what's possible, Richard said, spreading documents across the table. Harrison & Cole is valued at approximately $170 million, given current market conditions. You have access to about $6 million in liquid capital. That's a gap of $164 million. I'm aware of the math, I said. But here's what's interesting, said Jennifer Wu, one of the M&A specialists, pointing to a spreadsheet. The minority shareholders collectively own 40% of the company, which would be valued at about $68 million. But they're motivated sellers. They've been trying to liquidate for 2 years. In a motivated sales situation, we could potentially acquire their shares at a discount, say 20% below market value. That's still $54 million, I said, which you could potentially finance, said Marcus Rodriguez, the other M&A lawyer. You have $6 million for a down payment, significant assets to use as collateral, and a very compelling business case. You're not some outside investor trying to flip the company. You're literally the director of financial planning who knows the business inside and out. Banks would listen to that pitch. And the rest, I asked. Margaret's 60%? That's where it gets interesting, Jennifer said, and she was smiling now. The kind of smile sharks probably smile. Once you own Fortitude, you're no longer a minority shareholder. You're a major stakeholder with serious leverage. You could demand board representation, force strategic reviews, make her life very difficult if she doesn't negotiate with you. But that's not enough, I said. I don't want to be a thorn in her side. I want to own the company. Then you need to make her an offer she can't refuse, Marcus said. And you need to do it in a way that gives her no choice but to say yes. How? The accountant, a small woman named Helen Park, who'd been silent until now, cleared her throat. The company has been underperforming, she said, looking at the financial statements I'd brought. Net profit is down 7% year over year, mostly due to some aggressive expansion into markets that haven't panned out. If that continues, the company's value will drop. Margaret knows this. She's probably worried about it. So? So you approach her with an offer that does two things, Helen said. First, it values the company at the high end of the range, say 200 million, which means her 60% stake is worth 120 million. That's more than she'd get if she waited and the company continued to decline. Second, you structure it as a management buyout, which means she can sell her shares without looking like she's abandoning the family legacy. She's not selling to some corporate raider or private equity vulture. She's selling to her husband, the guy who's been helping run the place for a decade. It's clean, it's respectable. And expensive, I said. 120 million plus 54 million for the minorities is 174 million total, which you can finance, Richard said. Here's how this works. You use your 6 million as down payment and proof of serious intent. You get loans secured against your current assets, the house, your investments, everything, for another 10 to 15 million dollars. That gives you 21 million in cash, which is enough to buy out the minority shareholders at a discount and still have money for legal fees and closing costs. Then you go to Margaret with a leveraged buyout offer. You buy her 60% stake for 120 million, but the payment comes from a combination of bank loans secured against the company's own assets and a structured payout over 5 years. She keeps some skin in the game, Jennifer added. She gets, say, $50 million cash above front, then $14 million a year for 5 years. It's actually better for her tax situation. And it gives her confidence that the company will remain stable because you need it to be profitable to make those payments. I stared at them. This could actually work. It could, Richard said. But John, we're talking about taking on massive debt. If the company doesn't perform, if revenues drop, if anything goes wrong, you could lose everything. Your house, your savings, your trust fund, all of it. This is an enormous risk. What's the alternative, Sam? I asked. Let Margaret fire me? Spend the next 20 years climbing back up to where I already am? Watch her run this company with Connor Page while I'm unemployed and humiliated? You could walk away, Richard said quietly. Divorce her, take your assets, and start over somewhere else. I thought about that, really thought about it. There was a version of my future where I did exactly that. Filed for divorce, split our assets 50-50, moved to another city, got another job at another firm, rebuilt my career from scratch. It would be painful and expensive and soul-crushing, but it would be possible. But it wouldn't be enough, because Margaret had called me dead weight, had smirked about firing me, had planned my professional execution with the same casual efficiency she used to plan quarterly board meetings. And she'd done it while sleeping with another man in our bed, while wearing the jewelry I'd bought her, while spending money from the joint accounts I'd helped fill. She'd done it because she thought I was weak. I was going to prove her wrong. Let's do it, I said. All of it. The minority shareholders, the bank loans, the buyout offer. I want to own this company. Richard looked at the other lawyers, at Helen, back at me. Okay, he said, but we need to move fast. If Connor Page starts Monday, that means Margaret's timeline is already in motion. We need to approach the minority shareholders this week, get commitments, secure financing, and have everything ready before she realizes what's happening. How long? If we work around the clock, if everything goes perfectly, we could have the minority shares locked up by early next week. The financing might take another week after that. The offer to Margaret, he paused, calculating. 3 weeks, maybe less if we push. 3 weeks, I discovered Margaret's betrayal on a Wednesday. Connor Page was starting the following Monday. That gave us, I counted days in my head, 18 days if we included weekends. 18 days to buy a $170 million company out from under my wife without her noticing. We can do it, I said. We can try, Richard corrected. But John, You need to understand this is going to consume your life, every spare moment, every evening, every weekend. You'll be meeting with bankers and lawyers and shareholders while pretending everything is normal at home and at work. You'll be lying to Margaret's face every single day. You'll be, I've been lying to her face every day for 3 weeks already, I said. Ever since I found out she's been lying to mine. Richard nodded slowly. Okay then, let's buy you a company. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in compartmentalization. During the day, I was John Harrison, dutiful director of financial planning at Harrison & Cole Financial Services, attending meetings and reviewing reports and preparing for the arrival of my replacement. I smiled at Margaret in the hallways. I ate lunch at my desk. I stayed late working on the Q3 projections, exactly like I always did. But in the evenings and on weekends, I became someone else entirely. I became a man on a mission. The minority shareholders were our first targets. 12 people scattered across the country, most of them descended from the original partners who'd helped Margaret's great-grandfather build Harrison & Cole in the 1950s and 60s. They'd inherited their shares and collected dividends and generally treated the company like a retirement account they couldn't access, until I gave them the opportunity. Richard had drafted a standard offer. I would purchase their shares at 85% of current market value, paid in cash, closing within 30 days. It was less than full value, but it was certain money, immediate liquidity, and it came with a very clear deadline, except within 72 hours or the offer expired. We sent the offers on Friday evening. By Monday morning, 3 shareholders had accepted. By Wednesday, 7 more had agreed. By Friday of that second week, all 12 minority shareholders had signed agreements to sell me their 40% stake in Harrison & Cole Financial Services for a total of $54.4 million. I'd acquired 40% of my wife's company, and she had no idea. The financing was harder. Banks, it turns out, are cautious about lending $60+ million to a single individual, even one with substantial assets and a solid business plan. But Richard had connections and I had credibility, and the business case was genuinely strong. Harrison & Cole was a profitable company with stable revenue and excellent growth potential under the right management. We ended up structuring a complex deal involving 3 different banks with loans secured against my trust fund, my investment portfolio, my equity in the house, and the company shares I was acquiring. The interest rates weren't great. The terms were aggressive. If I missed a single payment, I'd lose everything. But the money was real. On Thursday of the 3rd week, 6 days before Connor Page was scheduled to start, 3 days before Margaret was planning to call me into her office with that smirk, I sat in a conference room with Richard and Helen and signed documents that officially made me the owner of 40% of Harrison & Cole Financial Services. "Congratulations," Richard said, shaking my hand. "You're now a major shareholder." "We're not done yet," I said. "Now comes the hard part." The hard part was Margaret. Helen had prepared a complete financial analysis of Harrison & Cole, a thick document that laid out exactly why the company was worth $200 million and exactly why Margaret should sell her 6% stake to me for $120 million. It was persuasive, professional, and completely airtight. The offer letter was 2 pages, drafted by Richard in language so precise it could have been poetry. It explained the terms: $50 million cash up front, $14 million per year for 5 years, a guaranteed board seat for Margaret if she wanted it, and complete operational control for me as the majority owner. We scheduled the presentation for Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. One business day before Connor Page's first day, 3 days before the breakfast meeting where Margaret planned to watch me shake hands with her boyfriend. "Are you ready for this?" Richard asked me that Friday morning. I was sitting in his office drinking coffee that tasted like anxiety, looking at the documents that could either liberate me or destroy me. "What happens if she says no?" I asked. "Then you own 40% of the company, which gives you significant leverage but not control. You could make her life difficult, force strategic changes, demand board representation. But she'd still be CEO. She could still fire you, still promote Connor, still run things however she wanted. You'd just be a very expensive nuisance. And if she says yes, then at 4:01 p.m. today, you become the majority owner of Harrison & Cole Financial Services. You become her boss, Connor Page's boss, everyone's boss. You control the company, the strategy, the personnel decisions, everything. I thought about Margaret's email. He's been dead weight for years. I thought about her smirk in her office. You'll be training your replacement. I thought about Connor Page, whoever he was, preparing for his first day at a new job, probably excited, probably grateful to Margaret for the opportunity, probably completely unaware that he was a pawn in a much larger game. I'm ready, I said. At 3:45 p.m., I called Margaret's office. Donna answered, sounding harried. Margaret Harrison's office. Dana, it's John. Is Margaret available? I need to speak with her urgently. She's in back-to-back meetings until 5. Can it wait? It's about a significant business opportunity. It really can't wait. I heard Dana put me on hold, heard muffled conversation, heard Margaret's voice saying something sharp and impatient. John? Margaret came on the line. What's so urgent? I need 15 minutes of your time. It's regarding a potential acquisition opportunity that requires your immediate attention. There was a pause. Margaret loved acquisitions. She'd built her reputation at Morrison & Associates by facilitating 3 major mergers. And at Harrison & Cole, she was always looking for ways to expand the portfolio. What kind of acquisition? I'd prefer to present it in person. Can you meet me in the main conference room at 4? Another pause. I could practically hear her weighing curiosity against irritation. Fine, she said. 4 p.m. This better be good, John. I think you'll find it very interesting, I said, and hung up before she could ask more questions. At 3:55 p.m., I walked into the main conference room with Richard and Helen. We'd set up a presentation on the large screen, financial documents arranged on the table, everything looking professional and official and completely routine. At 4 p.m. exactly, Margaret walked in. She was wearing a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on her nose. Her power outfit, the one she wore when she wanted to intimidate people. She looked at Richard and Helen with obvious confusion. John, what is this? Who are these people? Margaret, please sit down, I said. This is Richard Chen, my attorney, and Helen Park, a financial consultant. We have a business proposal to present to you. She sat down slowly, suspicion creeping into her expression. What kind of proposal? I picked up the remote for the presentation screen and clicked to the first slide. It was simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Acquisition proposal for Harrison & Cole Financial Services. Margaret stared at it, blinked, looked at me. I don't understand. Over the past 3 weeks, I said, and my voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone presenting a quarterly earnings report. I've been in negotiations to acquire Harrison & Cole. I'm here today to formally offer to purchase your 60% stake in the company for $120 million. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something that might have been fear. You're buying the company, she said slowly. You're trying to buy my company. Our company, I corrected gently. And I'm not trying, I've already acquired 40% of it. All 12 minority shareholders have agreed to sell me their stakes. The transactions close on Monday morning, which means that as of 9 a.m. Monday, I will own 40% of Harrison & Cole Financial Services. You'll own 60%. We'll be partners. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You can't. Where would you get the money for something like this? I have my resources, I said. The details are in the financial documentation. But the relevant fact is that I have secured sufficient financing to make this offer, and I have already completed the acquisition of the minority shares. The only question is whether you're willing to sell me your 60% stake and walk away with $120 million, or whether you'd prefer to remain as a minority partner while I control operational decisions. Minority partner? She was looking at me like I'd grown a second head. John, I'm the CEO. I'm the majority shareholder. I control this company. You're the CEO, I agreed, for now. But once I own 40%, I can demand board representation. I can challenge strategic decisions. I can make your life very difficult. Or, I clicked to the next slide, which showed the offer terms. You can accept a very generous buyout, walk away with more money than you'd ever see if you tried to sell your shares on the open market, and move on to whatever your next venture is. Margaret was breathing hard now, her face flushed. She looked at Richard, at Helen, back at me. "This is because of Connor," she said quietly. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "I'm sorry?" "You know about Connor. That's what this is about. You found out somehow and this is your revenge." I could have denied it, could have kept up the pretense of pure business. But looking at her across that conference table, seeing the fear and calculation in her eyes, I decided I was done pretending. "I've known for 3 weeks," I said quietly. "Since the Wednesday you left your laptop open and I read your emails. I know about the affair. I know about your plan to fire me after I train him. I know about the fake board promotion you were going to dangle in front of me while you dismantled my career. I know all of it, Margaret." She sat down slowly, and for just a moment, she looked genuinely shaken. "So yes," I continued, "this is about Connor, and about you, and about the fact that you called me dead weight, that you planned to humiliate me, that you thought I was too stupid, or too weak, or too domesticated to fight back." I leaned forward. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Margaret. I'm doing this because I'm a very good financial analyst, and I recognized an excellent acquisition opportunity when I saw one." "You bastard," she whispered. "I prefer majority shareholder," I said, "or soon to be if you accept this offer." She looked at the documents, at the numbers on the screen, and I could see her mind working through the possibilities. She could refuse, could try to maintain control, could attempt to outmaneuver me somehow. But she was also a financial expert. She could do the math. She could see that $120 million for her stake was actually a very good deal, better than she'd get anywhere else, especially if the company continued to underperform under her management. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "You have until Monday morning," I said. "Connor Page starts at 9 a.m. I'm sure you remember, you scheduled a breakfast meeting for the 3 of us. You wanted to watch me shake his hand. Watch me start training him to replace me." I smiled, and it felt like broken glass in my mouth. "If you accept my offer, we can have a very different kind of meeting on Monday. If you refuse, well, I'll be there as your new business partner. Either way, Monday should be interesting." Margaret stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked out without another word. Richard, Helen, and I sat in silence for a long moment. "That went well," Helen said dryly. "Will she accept?" I asked. Richard shrugged. "Hard to say. The offer is genuinely good. If she's thinking clearly, she'll take it. But emotion makes people irrational, and you just exposed her affair, her betrayal, and her complete misjudgment of you all at once. She might refuse just to spite you. And if she does? Then you own 40% of the company. She owns 60%, and you spend the next few years making each other miserable while the company suffers. It's not ideal, but it's not catastrophic either. You still have leverage. You still have options." I gathered the documents, clicked off the presentation, and looked at the conference room, the same room where I'd presented countless financial analyses, attended countless meetings, spent countless hours trying to prove my worth to a woman who'd already decided I had none. "Thank you," I said to Richard and Helen, "for everything." "Don't thank us yet," Richard said. "We won't know if this worked until Monday." I went home that night and found Margaret in the living room, sitting in the dark with a glass of wine, staring out the window at the city lights. "We need to talk," she said without looking at me. "Okay," I said. "How long have you been planning this?" 3 weeks, since the Wednesday I found your emails." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. 3 weeks. You found out I was cheating on you, that I was planning to fire you, and instead of confronting me, instead of yelling or crying or demanding an explanation, you just quietly bought the company. "Yes." "That's insane, John. You understand that, right? That's not normal behavior." "Neither is fucking your employee while planning to fire your husband," I said, and my voice was still calm, still measured, but there was steel in it now. "Neither is lying to someone for months while you systematically destroy their career and their marriage. So forgive me if my response wasn't normal." She finally looked at me, and in the dim light she looked older, tired, less like the polished executive and more like a woman who'd made a series of very bad decisions and was just now realizing the consequences. "I wasn't going to fire you," she said quietly. I laughed. "Margaret, I read your emails. He'll believe it right up until security is escorting him out. Those were your exact words." I was angry when I wrote that. I was venting to Connor. I didn't mean, "Don't," I said. And now my voice was hard, sharp, cutting through her excuses like a knife. "Don't lie to me anymore. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was anything other than exactly what it was. You wanted me gone. You wanted Connor in my place. You wanted to be free of your dead-weight husband. So you planned the most humiliating, efficient way to dispose of me. And you thought I'd never see it coming." She was silent. "Are you going to accept my offer?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "Probably. It's a good offer. Better than I deserve, actually, given everything." She took a long drink of her wine. "Where did you get the money, John? $6 million? You never said you had that kind of money." "My grandfather's trust fund. He set it up when I was 25, told me to let it grow, never touch it unless I absolutely needed it. I invested it well. It's been compounding for 20 years. And you never told me about it." "No, why not?" I thought about that, really thought about it, because part of me always knew I might need it someday. Part of me always knew this marriage was temporary, that you'd eventually decide I wasn't worth keeping around. "That's not fair," she said, but her voice was weak, unconvincing. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When did you stop loving me, Margaret? When did I become dead weight?" She didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. "Monday morning," I thought I said. "That's when I need your decision. Accept my offer, sell me your stake, and we can both move on. Or refuse, and we'll be partners. Either way, Connor Page isn't getting my job." I left her in the living room and went upstairs to the guest bedroom where I'd been sleeping for the past week. I lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Monday morning, thinking about the moment when everything would change, thinking about the look on Margaret's face when she finally understood that she'd underestimated me for the last time. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that felt like a sign from the universe, as if even the weather understood the significance of what was about to happen. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only appears in October, bright and sharp and absolutely cloudless. And the air had that crisp edge that makes you want to believe in new beginnings. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. in the guest bedroom, showered carefully and dressed in my best suit, the navy Tom Ford I'd bought for Margaret's promotion celebration 3 years ago, when I'd still believed our marriage was something worth celebrating. The suit fit perfectly because I'd lost about 8 pounds over the past 3 weeks, stress and anxiety burning through me like fuel, leaving me leaner and somehow more focused than I'd been in years. In the mirror, I looked like a different person. Or maybe I looked like the person I'd always been underneath the accommodating, domesticated exterior. My eyes were clear, alert, maybe a little cold. My jaw was set. I looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I looked like someone who owned a company. Downstairs, Margaret was already up, sitting at the kitchen counter with her laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside her arm. She was wearing one of her power suits, black, severe, expensive, and she looked like she hadn't slept at all. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself coffee. She didn't respond immediately, just kept staring at her screen, reading something with intense concentration. Finally, without looking up, she said, "I'm accepting your offer." I set down my coffee cup very carefully. "You're sure?" "My lawyer reviewed everything over the weekend. The terms are more than fair, actually generous considering." She trailed off, still not looking at me. "The documents are ready to sign. Richard sent them over an hour ago. I just need a minute." "Take all the time you need," I said. "We have an hour before the breakfast meeting." She laughed, that same bitter sound from Friday night. "The breakfast meeting. God, John, do you have any idea how much I'm dreading this?" "I imagine it's going to be uncomfortable," I said, "but probably less uncomfortable than you watching me train Connor while pretending to believe I was being promoted to the board." She finally looked at me, and there was something in her eyes, not quite regret, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to both. I really did mean to promote you eventually, you know. The board seat was real, just later, after Connor had settled in, after things had evolved. After you'd gotten rid of me, you mean? She didn't deny it. We stood there in our kitchen, in the house we'd bought together, surrounded by the accumulated debris of a decade of marriage. The expensive espresso machine Margaret had insisted we needed, the knife set I'd researched for 3 weeks before buying, the wedding photos still hanging on the wall, even though neither of us could remember the last time we'd looked at them. And I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection or regret, just a cool, clear sense of finality. I'm going to sign the documents now, Margaret said quietly. And then I'm going to go to that breakfast meeting and watch you introduce Connor Page to his new boss. And then I'm going to start figuring out what the hell I'm going to do with the rest of my life. You'll land on your feet, Epping, I said. You always do. And you'll have 120 million to cushion the fall. She pulled up the documents on her laptop, reviewed them one more time with the careful attention of someone who'd spent her entire career reading contracts, and then, at exactly 7:23 a.m., she signed them electronically. Each signature appeared on the screen in her precise digital handwriting, making the transfer of power official, legal, irreversible. At 7:24 a.m., I became the majority owner of Harrison and Cole Financial Services. At 7:25 a.m., I received a text from Richard. Congratulations, it's official, you own the company. At 7:26 a.m., Margaret closed her laptop, finished her cold coffee in one long swallow, and said, let's go meet Connor. The restaurant Margaret had chosen for the breakfast meeting was one of those aggressively pleasant places that cater to business people who want to conduct business without admitting they're conducting business. White tablecloths and understated flower arrangements, and waiters who moved with the silent efficiency of people who understood that conversations here were never really about the food. We arrived at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, and found a table near the windows overlooking the street. Margaret ordered coffee. I ordered coffee. We sat in silence, two people who used to share everything now having absolutely nothing to say to each other. At 8:57 a.m., Connor Page walked in. I'd been curious about what he'd look like, this man who'd been sleeping with my wife, who'd thought he was getting my job, who'd probably spent the weekend excitedly preparing for his first day at his new position. In my imagination, he'd been smug, arrogant, the kind of guy who wore expensive watches and talked too much about his gym routine. The reality was somehow worse. He was handsome in an unremarkable way, tall, dark hair, carefully styled, strong jawline, the kind of generically attractive that probably got him a lot of attention without him having to try very hard. He wore a gray suit that fit well but not perfectly, and he moved with the careful confidence of someone who was nervous but trying not to show it. He looked young, not actually young, he was probably in his early 30s, but young in the way that people who haven't been sufficiently disappointed by life yet and always look young, optimistic, eager, ready to take on the world. I almost felt sorry for him. Margaret! He smiled broadly as he approached our table, and I watched him lean in to kiss her cheek. Brief, professional, but there was an intimacy in the gesture that confirmed everything I'd read in those emails. Thanks for arranging this. Of course, Margaret said, and her voice was strained, artificial. Connor, I'd like you to meet John Harrison. John, this is Connor Page. Connor extended his hand, still smiling, completely oblivious. John, great to finally meet you. Margaret's told me so much about you. I'm really looking forward to learning from you these next few weeks. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, enthusiastic. Connor, welcome aboard. We sat down. A waiter materialized to take Connor's coffee order. Margaret fidgeted with her napkin. Connor pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to a fresh page. Pen at the ready, the eager student ready to learn. I've been reviewing the materials Margaret sent over, Connor said, looking at me. The financial planning structure at Harrison and Cole is really impressive. The way you've integrated traditional portfolio management with the newer algorithmic trading systems is cutting edge. I'm excited to dive into the details. It's a solid system, I agreed. Took about 5 years to build out fully, but it's performing well. Margaret mentioned you'll be transitioning to the board of directors? Connor continued, and there was genuine warmth in his voice, genuine respect. He thought he was talking to a mentor, someone who was graciously stepping aside to make room for new talent. That must be exciting. Board-level strategic work is fascinating. It's definitely going to be a change, I said. Margaret was staring at her coffee like she wanted to drown in it. Actually, I continued, there's been a slight change in the organizational structure that we should probably discuss before we get into the specifics of the transition plan. Connor looked up from his notes, attentive. Oh? Yes. You see, over the weekend, there was an acquisition. The ownership structure of Harrison & Cole has changed significantly. An acquisition? Connor glanced at Margaret, confused. You didn't mention. I acquired the company, I said calmly. As of this morning, I own 100% of Harrison & Cole Financial Services. I'm the sole owner and effectively the CEO. The silence that followed was exquisite. Connor's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, a glance at Margaret for clarification, back to confusion, and finally the slow, dawning horror of someone realizing they'd walked into a situation they completely misunderstood. Yeah, what? He finally managed. John bought the company, Margaret said flatly. All of it. He acquired the minority shares 3 weeks ago and purchased my majority stake this morning. So the organizational structure has changed somewhat from what we'd previously discussed. Connor looked at me, at Margaret, back at me. But you told me he was being promoted, that I'd be taking over his position, that we'd be working together. Plans change, I said. And actually, Connor, I'm glad we're all here together, because I wanted to talk to you about your position at Harrison & Cole. He was pale now, understanding beginning to crystallize. My position. Yes, you see, we don't actually need a new director of financial planning. I'm quite happy in that role, and I plan to continue in it while also handling the ownership responsibilities. What we do need, I paused, pulled out my own portfolio, extracted a document I'd prepared over the weekend, is a senior analyst position. It's a good role, important work, strong compensation package. Not quite at the director level, but certainly a solid position for someone with your background. I slid the document across the table to him. It was a genuine offer. I'd actually had Richard draft it for a senior analyst position reporting to me at about 60% of what Margaret had probably promised him for my job. Connor stared at it like it was written in a foreign language. You're offering me a demotion, he said slowly, before I've even started. I'm offering you at Ohio, I corrected, a real job at a company I now own. What Margaret offered you was my position, which she had no authority to promise because she was planning to fire the current occupant, me, through a combination of deception and manipulation. This is an honest offer for honest work. Connor looked at Margaret. Is this because of us? And there it was, the confirmation out loud, in front of witnesses, that they were indeed us. Margaret's face flushed. Connor, I think we should talk about this privately. No, Connor said, and there was anger in his voice now. No. I think we should talk about this right here. You told me your marriage was over. You told me you were separated emotionally, that it was just paperwork and logistics. You told me this job was real, that it was an opportunity, that it was... He stopped, looked at me. Did you know about us? For 3 weeks, I said. Since I read Margaret's emails outlining her plan to have me train you and then fire me. Connor actually flinched. Jesus Christ, Margaret. Connor, if you'd just let me explain. Margaret started, but he was already standing up, gathering his portfolio, his face a mixture of humiliation and fury. I don't need you to explain, he said. I need to get out of here before this gets any worse. He looked at me. I'm sorry, I had no idea about any of this. The affair, the plan to fire you, none of it. She told me you were already separated, that this was all amicable. I believe you, I said, and I did. Connor Page was many things, naive, ambitious, willing to sleep with his boss, but he wasn't actively malicious. He was just a guy who'd gotten seduced by an attractive older woman with promises of career advancement, never thinking to question whether those promises were legitimate. The job offer is real, I added. If you want it, no hard feelings, no complications, just work. Think about it, and let me know by the end of the week. Connor nodded, still looking shell-shocked, and walked out of the restaurant without another word. Margaret and I sat in silence for a long moment. The waiter, sensing the change in atmosphere, wisely stayed away. That was cruel, Margaret finally said. Was it? I asked. I offered him a job. A real job. That's more than you were going to give me. I meant the public humiliation. Making him find out like this. In front of everyone. In front of you and me, you mean? That's hardly everyone. And as for humiliation, Margaret, you were planning to have me shake his hand and train him to replace me while believing I was being promoted. You were planning to watch me smile and nod and graciously pass along my knowledge, all while knowing you were about to destroy my career. So forgive me if I don't feel too terrible about Connor Page having one uncomfortable breakfast. She had no response to that. I finished my coffee, left cash on the table for the bill, and stood up. I'm going to the office. I have a company to run. You're welcome to come in and clear out your office today, or you can do it later this week. Whatever's more convenient. You're firing me, she said quietly. I'm accepting your resignation, I corrected. You sold me the company, Margaret. You're no longer an employee. You're no longer the CEO. You're just someone who used to work here and who used to be married to me. Used to be? I'll have the divorce papers drawn up this week, I said. We can keep it simple. You get the house, I get the company. Clean break. She looked up at me with something that might have been tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. I'm sorry, she said. For what it's worth, I really am sorry, John. I believe you, I said, but sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't give me back 10 years of marriage to someone who called me dead weight. Sorry doesn't undo the plan to fire me, the affair, the lies. Sorry is just a word you say when you have been caught. I left her sitting there and walked out into the bright October morning. The office felt different when I walked in at 9:30 a.m. Nothing had physically changed. Same cubicles, same conference rooms, same break room with its perpetual smell of burned popcorn. But I was different, and that changed everything. People noticed immediately. Donna did a double take when she saw me walking past Margaret's office, my office now, and I saw her glance at her calendar, confused. The Monday morning staff meeting was supposed to be at 10 a.m., and Margaret always led it, but Margaret wasn't there, and I was walking toward the executive suite with purpose. John? Dana called out, hurrying after me. Is everything okay? Where's Margaret? Margaret won't be in today, I said. There's been a change in the company's organizational structure. Can you gather everyone in the main conference room for 10 a.m.? I need to make an announcement. An announcement? Should I call Margaret? No need, she's aware. Dana looked like she wanted to ask more questions, but something in my expression stopped her. She nodded and pulled out her phone to start messaging people. I walked into Margaret's office, my office, and stood for a moment taking it in. The mahogany desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the view of the city's skyline stretching out like a promise. This was what success looked like. This was what power looked like. This was what revenge looked like when it was executed perfectly. Richard Chen arrived at 9:45 a.m., looking pleased with himself. Thought you might want some legal representation for the announcement, he said. Good thinking. How did the breakfast go? Connor Page left about 5 minutes in. Margaret stayed long enough for me to explain that she's no longer employed here. I'd call it a success. Richard grinned. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Enjoying is a strong word, I said. But yes, I was enjoying it. Not in a vindictive, petty way, or not only in that way. I was enjoying the feeling of control, of having planned something complex and difficult and executed it flawlessly. I was enjoying the knowledge that I'd been underestimated and had proven everyone wrong. I was enjoying not being dead weight. At 10 a.m., I walked into the main conference room where about 40 people, the senior staff, department heads, key analysts, had gathered with varying levels of confusion and concern. Whenever the CEO calls an emergency meeting, people assume the worst. Layoffs, scandals, bankruptcy. I stood at the head of the table, Richard beside me, and I looked at faces I'd known for years. Marcus in accounting, who taught me how to read cash flow statements when I was a junior analyst. Linda in client services, who'd covered for me when I took a long weekend for my honeymoon. Robert in trading, who'd been a mentor when I was figuring out the algorithmic systems. They all looked worried. "Good morning," and I said. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice. I know this is irregular, but there's been a significant development that affects the entire company." The worry intensified. Someone, I think it was Marcus, actually closed his eyes like he was bracing for impact. "As of this morning, Harrison & Cole Financial Services has new ownership. I've acquired 100% of the company's shares, making me the sole owner and CEO." The silence was profound, broken only by someone dropping a pen. "Margaret Harrison has resigned her position and sold her stake in the company. The transition is complete, legal, and final. Nothing about your employment status, your compensation, or your day-to-day responsibilities will change. Harrison & Cole will continue to operate exactly as it has been, with the same strategic direction and commitment to our clients." Linda raised her hand tentatively, like she was in school. "John, but what does this mean for the company's leadership structure?" "I'll be taking over as CEO in addition to my current role as Director of Financial Planning. We may make some organizational changes over the coming weeks, but they'll be thoughtful and strategic, not reactive. The company is financially sound, our client relationships are strong, and our future is secure." "What about Margaret?" someone else asked. Is she okay?" I appreciated the question. Margaret had been their boss for years, and despite everything, she'd been good to most of them. "Margaret is fine," I said. "This was a mutually agreed upon transaction. She'll be pursuing other opportunities, and I wish her well." It was the most diplomatic lie I'd told all morning. Any other questions? There were dozens, but people were too shocked to articulate them. Robert finally spoke up. "When you say you acquired the company, how does someone just acquire a company? Over a weekend?" I smiled. "Very carefully, with excellent legal counsel, and with resources most people didn't know I had. The details are complicated, but the result is simple. I own Harrison & Cole, and I'm committed to making it even more successful than it's been." Richard stepped forward. "I'm Richard Chen from Chen & Associates. I handled the legal aspects of the acquisition. Everything was done properly, all filings are complete, and I'm available to answer any specific questions about the transition process." The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, with people slowly processing the news and asking increasingly detailed questions about what this meant for specific projects, specific clients, specific initiatives. I answered what I could and promised transparency going forward. When it finally broke up, people filed out in small clusters, already gossiping, already trying to make sense of what had just happened. Marcus lingered, waiting until everyone else had left. "John," he said quietly, that was something." "Thank you?" "No, I mean it. I've been here for 7 years, and I've seen Margaret fire 3 people with promises of promotions that never materialized. I always wondered if someone would finally call her on it." He paused. "Was it you? Were you supposed to be next?" "Yes," I said simply. Marcus nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad you fought back, and I'm glad you won." He extended his hand. "Congratulations, boss." We shook, and he left me alone in the conference room with Richard. "That went well," Richard said. "Phase 1 complete," I agreed. "Now comes the hard part." "Which is?" "Actually running the company." The thing about acquiring a company in a fit of justified revenge is that afterward, you actually have to run the company. This revelation hit me about 3 days after the breakfast meeting, when I was sitting in my new office at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night, surrounded by reports I needed to review, budgets I needed to approve, strategic decisions I needed to make, and the slowly dawning realization that being CEO was significantly more complicated than being Director of Financial Planning. As Director, I'd been responsible for one department, one set of functions, one clear area of expertise. I could spend my days analyzing numbers and building models and making recommendations that other people would implement or ignore according to their own judgment. As CEO, every decision was mine. Every problem ultimately landed on my desk. Every dissatisfied client, every underperforming department, every strategic question about whether we should expand into European markets or double down on Asia. I was Xiao. All of it came to me. It was exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. The first week I made a lot of mistakes. I approved a marketing budget that was 30% too high because I didn't fully understand our client acquisition costs. I scheduled 3 meetings at the same time because I was still learning my calendar system. I accidentally offended our oldest client by forgetting he preferred phone calls to emails. A detail Margaret had apparently kept in her head without documenting anywhere. But I learned quickly. By the second week, I'd hired an executive assistant, a frighteningly competent woman named Patricia, who'd previously worked for a CEO at Goldman Sachs, and who took one look at my chaotic schedule and said, "We need to restructure your entire day. Starting now." Patricia taught me about time blocking, about the difference between urgent and important, about how to delegate without micromanaging. She introduced me to systems for tracking everything from client communications to employee performance reviews. She basically became my external brain, and I have no idea how I survived before she arrived. By the third week, I'd settled into a rhythm. Mornings for strategic thinking and important decisions. Afternoons for meetings and client calls. Evenings for deep work on complex analyses. Weekends for reading industry reports and thinking about long-term vision. It was consuming, all-encompassing, the kind of work that takes over your entire life if you let it. And I let it, because what else did I have? My marriage was over. Margaret had moved out of our house within a week of the breakfast meeting, taking her clothes and her toiletries and leaving behind everything else like she was fleeing a crime scene. The divorce papers were filed, uncontested, proceeding with the mechanical efficiency of people who just wanted it over with. I had no social life to speak of. Most of our friends had been Margaret's friends, industry people who'd sided with her the moment the news got out. A few reached out with awkward sympathy, but I let those relationships lapse. I didn't need their pity. I had the company. I had work. I had the satisfaction of proving that I was more than dead weight, more than the accommodating husband who'd let himself be pushed aside. I had the quiet pleasure of success. Connor Page accepted my job offer. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon, about 10 days after the breakfast meeting, sounding cautious and slightly embarrassed. "John, it's Connor Page. Do you have a minute?" "Of course. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk about the position you offered, the senior analyst role." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city skyline. "Are you interested?" "I am, actually. I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past week, and I realize I made some very poor decisions. Getting involved with Margaret professionally and personally was a mistake. I let ambition cloud my judgment, and I ended up in a situation that was compromised." "That's a diplomatic way of putting it," I said. "I'm trying to be honest without being self-pitying," Connor said. "Look, I know I don't deserve your consideration. I was sleeping with your wife, I was planning to take your job, and even if I didn't know the full extent of what Margaret was planning, I knew enough to feel uncomfortable about it. But I'm a good analyst. I work hard, I'm smart, and I think I could contribute meaningfully to Harrison and Cole if you're willing to give me a chance." I appreciated the directness. No excuses, no elaborate justifications, just acknowledgement and a request for opportunity. "Can I ask you a question?" I said. "Of course. When Margaret first approached you about this position, what did she tell you about me?" Connor was silent for a moment. "She said you were brilliant but complacent, that you'd been in the same role for too long and had stopped growing. She said the board wanted to move you up to more strategic work, and they needed someone with fresh energy and new ideas to take over financial planning. And you believed her." "I wanted to believe her," Connor corrected. "It was a great opportunity, and she was very convincing, both professionally and personally." "Did you love her?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why that mattered. "No," Connor said immediately. "I was infatuated, flattered that someone successful and attractive was interested in me. But love? No, and I don't think she loved me either. I think she saw me as a solution to a problem, and I was too naive to see it." "That's probably accurate," I said. "Margaret is very good at seeing people as solutions to problems." "So," Connor said, "the job. Are you serious about it, or was that offer just a way to twist the knife in front of Margaret?" I laughed despite myself. It was a little bit both. But yes, the offer is serious. We do need a strong senior analyst, and your background is solid. If you're willing to work hard, report to me without resentment about the circumstances, and keep your personal life completely separate from your professional life, then I'd be happy to have you on the team. I can do all of that, Connor said. When would you want me to start? How about Monday? Monday works. And that's how I ended up hiring my wife's former lover to work for me at the company I'd bought to prevent him from taking my job. The truly strange thing was that Connor turned out to be excellent. He started that Monday with appropriate humility and threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone trying to prove something. He was smart, detail-oriented, and willing to admit when he didn't understand something, a trait I valued more than natural brilliance. He also kept his head down and avoided any mention of Margaret, the affair, or the circumstances of his hiring. We had a strictly professional relationship, and it worked. 3 months into his tenure, he helped me identify a significant inefficiency in our portfolio rebalancing process that saved the company about $2.3 million annually. 6 months in, he caught an error in a major client proposal that would have been catastrophically expensive if it had gone through. A year in, I promoted him to lead analyst. People found it weird, of course. The office gossip about me hiring Margaret's boyfriend was relentless for the first few months. But eventually, when it became clear that Connor was genuinely good at his job and that there was no drama or conflict, people moved on to newer, more interesting gossip. And Connor and I developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was more than just professional collegiality. We got coffee sometimes, talked about markets and strategy, occasionally touched on personal topics in the careful way that men do when they're not entirely comfortable with emotional vulnerability. One day, about 18 months after he'd started, we were working late on a particularly complex merger analysis, and Connor looked up from his spreadsheet and said, "Can I ask you something personal? Depends on the question. Do you hate me?" I set down my pen and looked at him. "No, why would you think that?" "Because I slept with your wife. Because I was part of her plan to destroy your career. Because every time you look at me, you must think about what happened." "When I look at you," I said carefully, "I think about the analysis you did on the Hendricks merger extension, or the work you're doing right now. I don't think about Margaret." "Really?" "Really, Connor. You were a pawn in Margaret's game. An ambitious, naive pawn who made poor choices, but still a pawn. The person responsible for what happened was Margaret. She's the one who was married to me. She's the one who chose to cheat. She's the one who planned to fire me. You were just collateral damage in her decision-making process." "That's generous," Connor said. "It's accurate," I corrected. "And honestly, hiring you was one of the better decisions I've made as CEO. You're good at this, Connor. You're worth considerably more than the drama that came with you." He smiled, looking relieved. "Thanks, that means a lot." We went back to work, and I realized that I'd meant what I said. I didn't hate Connor Page. I didn't even particularly resent him. He was just a guy who'd made a mistake and was trying to do better, which was more than I could say for Margaret. Speaking of Margaret, I saw her exactly 3 times in the 2 years after the acquisition. The first time was at our divorce proceedings, 6 months after the breakfast meeting. We sat in a conference room with our lawyers and signed documents that formally ended our marriage with the same businesslike efficiency that had characterized the end of everything else. She looked different, thinner, harder somehow. Her hair cut shorter in a style that probably cost $400 but made her look severe rather than elegant. She was polite, professional, and utterly impersonal. We could have been strangers negotiating a real estate transaction. "How's the company doing?" she asked at one point, while our lawyers were reviewing some final paperwork. "Well," I said, "we're up 12% year over year. Client retention is at 96%, and we just signed 2 major new accounts." She nodded. "I always said you were brilliant at the actual work. It was the politics you struggled with." "Turns out I'm better at politics than you thought," I said. "Or maybe I just needed proper motivation." Something flickered across her face. Regret, maybe, or just discomfort at being reminded of what she'd done. "John, I know I've said this before, but I am sorry. Truly, I handled everything badly. The affair, the plan to fire you, all of it. I was selfish and cruel, and you didn't deserve it. No, I agreed. I didn't. For what it's worth, I'm seeing a therapist now, trying to understand why I make the choices I make, why I sabotage good things. That's good, I said, and I meant it. I hope it helps. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I'd just been honest? If I'd told you I was unhappy, that I wanted something different, that our marriage wasn't working? I considered the question. We probably would have gotten divorced anyway, but it would have been cleaner, kinder. You wouldn't have destroyed my trust in human nature, and I wouldn't have had to buy a company to avoid being destroyed. She laughed quietly. You really did that, didn't you? Bought an entire company just to avoid being fired. I bought a company because it was a good investment and because I was tired of being underestimated, I corrected. The fact that it also prevented you from firing me was just a bonus. The lawyers finished their review. We signed the final documents. Margaret Harrison became Margaret Harrison Single again, though she dropped the hyphenate and went back to using her family name exclusively. I became John Harrison, divorced CEO, owner of a financial services company, and someone who now understood exactly what he was capable of when pushed. We shook hands at the end of the meeting. Her grip was firm but brief. Good luck with everything, she said. You too. And that was it. 10 years of marriage dissolved with a handshake and legal documents. The second time I saw Margaret was about a year later at an industry conference in Chicago. I was giving a keynote speech about innovative approaches to portfolio management. The company's success had made me something of an industry figure, and I'd been invited to speak at several conferences. Margaret was in the audience. I noticed her halfway through my presentation, sitting in the back row, and for just a moment, I lost my place in my notes. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not friendly, just attentive. I finished the speech to solid applause, did the Q&A session, and was immediately surrounded by people wanting to network. By the time I extracted myself, Margaret was gone, but she'd left a note with the conference organizer who handed it to me with a knowing smile. John, great speech. You were always better at explaining complex concepts than I gave you credit for. The company is lucky to have you. I hope you're happy. But I read it twice, folded it carefully, and threw it away. I was happy, I realized. Not in the same way I'd been happy during the early years of our marriage, that optimistic, naive happiness of someone who thought they'd found their person and their path. This was different, quieter, more solid. I was happy because I'd built something, because I'd taken a terrible situation and transformed it into something meaningful, because I'd proven to Margaret, to myself, to everyone who'd underestimated me, that I was more than anyone thought. That was worth something. The third time I saw Margaret was the strangest. It was 2 years after the acquisition, at a coffee shop near my office. I'd stopped in for my usual afternoon espresso and found her sitting at a corner table, working on her laptop. She looked up as I approached the counter, and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she gestured to the empty chair at her table. Want to sit for a minute? She asked. I should have said no, should have gotten my coffee and left. But curiosity won out. Sure, I said. I ordered, got my espresso, and sat down across from my ex-wife. How are you, John? I'm well. You? Good, actually. I've been consulting, helping startups with their financial strategy. It's interesting work, less corporate, more entrepreneurial. That sounds like a good fit, I said, and I meant it. Margaret had always been better at strategy than execution, better at the big picture than the daily grind. I heard you're dating someone, she said, and there was something careful in her voice. Patricia mentioned it when I ran into her last month. My executive assistant apparently was keeping tabs on my personal life for my ex-wife's benefit. I am, I said. Her name is Rachel. She's a data scientist. Are you happy? Yes, I said, and I was. Rachel was smart, funny, completely uninterested in office politics, and had no connection to my previous life. We'd been seeing each other for about 6 months, and it was easy in a way my marriage to Margaret had never been. Margaret nodded, looking into her coffee. I'm glad. You deserve to be happy. So do you, I said, surprising myself. Do I? She looked up. After everything I did? People make mistakes, I said. Even terrible ones. That doesn't mean they deserve to be miserable forever. She smiled, sad and genuine. When did you become so wise? When I bought a company in 3 weeks to avoid being destroyed by my wife, I said. Adversity is a hell of a teacher. We sat in silence for a moment. Two people who'd once promised to spend their lives together, now strangers who happened to share a history. I think about it sometimes, Margaret said finally. The moment I wrote that email about you being dead weight, if I could take back one thing, one sentence from my entire life, it would be that. Because it wasn't true. You were never dead weight, John. You were the smartest person in that company. And I knew it, and I resented you for it because it meant I could never fully control you. So you tried to get rid of me. So I tried to get rid of you, she agreed. And instead you became my boss, hired my boyfriend, bought my company, and built a better version of it than I ever could have. There's a poetic justice in that. There's something in it, I said. She closed her laptop, gathering her things. I should go. I have a meeting. But John, thank you. For what? For not destroying me. You could have. You had every right to make my professional life hell, to badmouth me in the industry, to make sure I never worked again. But you didn't. You just moved forward. Destruction is easy, I said. Building something better is harder, but more satisfying. She stood up, hesitated, then leaned down and kissed my cheek. Brief, friendly, final. Goodbye, John. Goodbye, Margaret. She walked out of the coffee shop, and I watched her go. This woman who had been my wife, my betrayer, my catalyst for transformation. I felt nothing but a distant fondness, the way you might feel about a character in a book you read years ago and barely remember. The past was the past. I finished my espresso and went back to work. 5 years after the acquisition, Harrison & Cole Financial Services had become something I'd never quite imagined during those frantic 3 weeks of buying the company. We doubled our client base, tripled our assets under management, expanded into 4 new markets, and launched 3 new service lines. Revenue was up 180% from where it had been under Margaret's leadership. Net profit had grown even faster. I'd been profiled in the Wall Street Journal, invited to speak at Davos, approached by private equity firms interested in buying the company for what one analyst called, frankly, absurd valuations. I turned them all down, because somewhere in those 5 years, I'd realized something important. I didn't want to build an empire. I wanted to build something sustainable, meaningful, human-scaled. Harrison & Cole, under my leadership, looked different than it had under Margaret. We had better work-life balance, higher employee retention, a culture that valued collaboration over competition, long-term thinking over quarterly results, people over pure profit. We were successful, but we were also decent. You're leaving money on the table, my CFO, a brilliant woman named Sandra Kim, who I'd promoted 3 years earlier, told me one day. We could be aggressive, expand faster, squeeze more profit. We could be a billion-dollar company in 5 years if you wanted. Do I want that? I asked. I don't know. Do you? I thought about it, really thought about it. No, I said finally. I want to build something excellent, something sustainable, something where people want to work, where clients are genuinely served, where we do good work and make good money without becoming monsters in the process. Sandra smiled. Then we're on the right track. Connor Page left Harrison & Cole after 4 years. He came into my office one Tuesday morning looking nervous and excited in equal measure. I need to tell you something, he said. You're leaving, I said. He blinked, surprised. How did you know? You've been checking your phone more often. You've been finishing projects ahead of schedule. You've been mentioning a friend's startup in California with the kind of interest that means you're thinking about joining them. The signs were there. Connor laughed. I guess I'm more transparent than I thought. So what's the opportunity? He told me about a fintech startup in San Francisco, early stage but promising, led by people he respected. They'd offered him a VP position, equity, the chance to build something from scratch. It sounds perfect for you, I said. It does, doesn't it? He paused. John, I wanted to say, working here, learning from you, It's been the most important professional experience of my life. When I started, I thought I knew what success looked like: ambition, advancement, climbing the ladder as fast as possible. But you showed me something different, which is that excellence is its own reward, that building something meaningful is better than just chasing titles and money, that sometimes the most successful revenge is just being better than the people who doubted you. I smiled. That's a good lesson to learn. I learned it from you. Even though I was the guy sleeping with your wife, even though I was literally hired to replace you, you treated me with respect and gave me opportunities to grow. That meant something. You earned those opportunities, Connor. You're talented, hardworking, and you learn from your mistakes. That's all anyone can ask. We shook hands, and 2 weeks later, Connor moved to San Francisco. We stayed in touch, occasional emails, phone calls when he needed advice, dinner whenever I was in California. He became genuinely successful, helped build his startup into something significant, and eventually reached out to thank me again for giving him a second chance. You didn't give me a second chance, I told him during one of those dinners. You gave yourself a second chance. I just didn't stand in your way. Rachel and I got married 3 years after the divorce from Margaret was finalized. It was a small ceremony, immediate family, a few close friends, no industry colleagues or business contacts. We got married on a beach in Maine, early October, the same time of year when I discovered Margaret's betrayal and bought the company and changed my entire life. Does it feel strange? Rachel asked me the night before the wedding, as we sat on the deck of our rental cottage, watching the sunset over the Atlantic. Getting married in the same month you found out your first wife was cheating on you? A little, I admitted, but also fitting. October was when everything fell apart. Maybe it should also be when everything comes together. That's very poetic for a financial analyst, she said, kissing my cheek. I've had a lot of practice being introspective, I said. Rachel was nothing like Margaret. Where Margaret had been ambitious and calculating, Rachel was curious and genuine. Where Margaret had seen people as tools or obstacles, Rachel saw them as complex, interesting puzzles to understand. Where Margaret had wanted to conquer, Rachel wanted to explore. She knew the whole story, of course. I'd told her everything on our third date, figuring it was better to be upfront about the whole bought a company to avoid being fired by my cheating wife thing. She'd listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and then said, "So you're telling me that when you're backed into a corner, you're capable of executing a brilliant, complex plan with perfect patience and discipline?" Yes, I suppose that's one way to interpret it. Good, she'd said. I appreciate competence. She'd met Margaret once at that industry conference where I'd been speaking. Margaret had introduced herself politely, and they'd had a brief, pleasant conversation about data science applications in financial modeling. Afterward, Rachel had said, "She's very elegant and deeply sad, I think." Sad? She looks at you like she lost something valuable and doesn't quite know how it happened. Do you feel bad for her? I'd asked. A little, Rachel admitted, but mostly I feel grateful. Because if she hadn't betrayed you, you wouldn't have bought the company, and you wouldn't have been giving that speech where we met, and we wouldn't be here. So in a weird way, her being terrible led to something good. It was a generous way to look at it, and very Rachel. 6 years after the acquisition, I got an unexpected email from Margaret Harrison to John Harrison. Subject: a favor to ask, John. I hope this email finds you well. I've been following Harrison and Cole's success from a distance, and I'm genuinely impressed with what you've built. The company is thriving in ways I never achieved, and you should be proud. I'm writing because I need advice. I've been offered a CEO position at a mid-sized consulting firm. It's a good opportunity, but I'm hesitant. My last experience with leadership ended badly, as you know, and I'm not sure I trust my own judgment anymore. I know it's strange to ask this of you, given our history, but you're one of the smartest people I know, and I trust your perspective. Would you be willing to have coffee and let me talk through this decision? I understand if you'd rather not, but I thought I'd ask, Margaret. I stared at the email for a long time. Rachel found me in my study that evening, still looking at it. What's wrong? She asked. Margaret wants to meet for coffee. She's been offered a CEO position and wants my advice. Rachel sat down beside me. What do you want to do? I don't know. Part of me thinks I should just delete the email and move on. She's not my responsibility. Her career choices aren't my problem. But another part of you? Rachel prompted. Another part of me remembers that I learned some of my best skills from her, that she was brilliant in her own way, even if she was terrible to me, that maybe helping her become a better leader is worth an hour of my time. Then do it, Rachel said simply. You're not the person you were 6 years ago, the one she could hurt. You're someone different now, someone stronger. An hour of coffee can't change that. So I met Margaret for coffee. We met at that same coffee shop where we'd had our last conversation, in what had become an accidental tradition of closure. She looked better than she had 2 years earlier, more relaxed, more settled, like she'd finally made peace with something. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat down. Tell me about the opportunity, I said. She explained, a consulting firm specializing in financial restructuring for struggling companies, about 200 employees, solid reputation but stagnant growth. They wanted her to come in as CEO and reinvigorate the business. It's exactly the kind of challenge I'm good at, she said. Strategic thinking, high-level restructuring, working with sophisticated clients. But I'm afraid I'll make the same mistakes I made at Harrison and Cole. Which mistakes specifically? I asked. All of them. Prioritizing growth over people, seeing employees as resources instead of humans, making decisions based on what serves me rather than what serves the organization, being the kind of leader who inspires fear instead of loyalty. Those are good things to be afraid of, I said. It means you're aware of them. But awareness doesn't equal change. I'm still the same person who betrayed you, who planned to fire you, who was willing to destroy your career for my own convenience. Are you? I asked. The same person? Because from where I'm sitting, the Margaret I knew 6 years ago wouldn't have asked for advice. She wouldn't have acknowledged her mistakes. She certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking about prioritizing people over growth. She smiled faintly. Therapy has been enlightening. Then my advice is this: take the job, but build in accountability. Find a mentor, someone whose judgment you trust, and give them permission to tell you when you're making decisions from ego instead of wisdom. Create systems that prevent you from centralizing too much power. Hire people who will challenge you, and remember that leadership is service, not dominance. That's good advice, Margaret said. I learned most of it from fixing the problems you created, I said, but I smiled when I said it, taking the edge off. I did create problems, didn't I? You created a lot of problems, I agreed, but you also built a solid foundation. Harrison and Cole was a good company when I took over. You'd established strong client relationships, developed good systems, hired talented people. You just lost sight of why you were doing it. And you didn't? I almost did, I admitted. The first year after the acquisition, I was so focused on proving you wrong, on being successful out of spite, that I nearly became the same kind of leader you were, obsessed with growth, with winning, with being right. What changed? Connor Page, actually. Margaret looked genuinely surprised. Connor? He asked me one day why I was working so hard, what I was trying to prove, and I realized I was still fighting a battle that was already over. You were gone. The company was mine, I'd won, but I was still operating like someone who needed to prove something, and it was making me miserable and making everyone around me miserable. So what did you do? I stopped trying to win and started trying to build. Stopped comparing myself to you and started asking what kind of leader I actually wanted to be. Stopped seeing the company as a trophy I'd seized and started seeing it as a community I was responsible for. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. I think that's my problem, she said finally. I've always seen leadership as winning, as being the smartest person in the room, making the best decisions, proving I deserve to be in charge. But that's not leadership, is it? No, I said gently. It's insecurity dressed up as competence. She laughed, surprised and a little hurt. That's harsh, but true. But true, she agreed. God, John, how did you get so wise? I had an excellent negative example to learn from, I said. And this time we both laughed. We talked for another hour about leadership and growth and the difference between building something meaningful and just accumulating power. I told her about the mistakes I'd made, the lessons I'd learned, the ways I'd structured Harrison and Cole to prevent the kind of toxic culture that could develop when one person had too much control. You know what's strange? Margaret said as we were getting ready to leave. You're a better version of what I always wanted to be. Successful without being ruthless, powerful without being cruel, respected because you've earned it, not because people are afraid of you. I learned from your mistakes, I said. That's actually a gift if you think about it. You showed me exactly what not to do. So I was useful after all, she said dryly. You were always useful, Margaret. You were just also terrible to me. I was, she agreed. I'm sorry doesn't really cover it, does it? No, I said, but it's a start. We stood up, gathering our things. Two people who'd been married and divorced and had somehow ended up here, in a coffee shop, offering each other wisdom. Take the job, I said, and be the kind of CEO you wish you'd been the first time around. You're capable of it. You just have to choose it. Thank you, John, for the advice, for meeting with me, for not hating me. I don't hate you, I said honestly. I haven't for years. You were a chapter in my life, and that chapter's over. Now you're just someone I used to know who's trying to do better. That's all any of us can hope for, I suppose. We shook hands. No hug, no kiss on the cheek, just a professional handshake between two people who understood each other in the complicated way that only former spouses can. I watched her walk away and I realized I felt nothing but a distant hope that she'd figure it out, that she'd become the leader she was capable of being. And then I went back to my office, to my company, to my life, and I didn't think about Margaret Harrison again for a very long time. 8 years after the acquisition, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the same month I'd discovered the emails, bought the company, changed everything. I sat in my office looking at an offer that would change everything again. $340 million. That's what the private equity firm was offering for Harrison and Cole Financial Services. Complete acquisition, immediate liquidity, a clean exit that would make me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd scraped together $6 million to start this whole adventure. Sandra Kim sat across from me, calculator and spreadsheets spread across the conference table, looking at me with the patient expression of someone waiting for a decision. It's a good offer, she said. Actually, it's an exceptional offer. About 30% above market value. They're betting on our growth trajectory and willing to pay a premium. Why? I asked. Because we're profitable, stable, and well-managed. Because you've built something that runs smoothly enough that it doesn't require your constant attention. Because, and I'm quoting from their analysis here, Harrison and Cole represents the gold standard for mid-sized financial services firms. Excellent returns, stellar reputation, sustainable growth, and a corporate culture that attracts and retains top talent. I read through the offer document again, all those numbers and terms and conditions that would transform my life's work into a wire transfer. What do you think I should do? I asked Sandra. I think you should do whatever makes you happy, she said. Financially, selling makes sense. You'd walk away with enough money to retire comfortably, invest in other ventures, spend the rest of your life doing whatever you want. But financially isn't the only consideration. What else is there? She gestured around the office, out toward the bullpen where analysts worked at their desks, toward the conference rooms where clients met with advisors, toward the whole ecosystem we'd built. This, she said, what you've built here, the people who work for you, the clients who trust you, the culture you've created, that has value too. Not the kind you can put on a spreadsheet, but value nonetheless. I thought about the past 8 years, thought about Connor Page, who joined as my wife's boyfriend and become a genuinely valued colleague before moving on to his own success. Thought about Sandra herself, who I'd promoted from senior analyst to CFO and who'd helped shape the company's strategic direction. Thought about Patricia, my executive assistant, who'd organized my chaos into something functional. Thought about the 100 other employees who came to work every day and did excellent work and trusted me to lead them well. Thought about what it would mean to sell all of that to a private equity firm that would inevitably optimize and restructure and extract value in ways that would probably destroy everything good about Harrison and Cole. I don't want to sell, I said. Sandra smiled. Good, neither do I. Even though you'd get a significant payout as CFO, even though this would make you wealthy? I'm already wealthy enough, she said. I'd rather keep building something meaningful. I picked up the offer document and set it aside. Then let's keep building. 10 years after the acquisition, I did something I'd been planning for a while. I made Harrison and Cole an employee-owned company. Not entirely, I retained 51% in ownership to maintain strategic control, but I distributed 49% of shares to employees based on tenure, performance, and contribution. Senior people like Sandra got significant stakes. Junior analysts got smaller, but still meaningful shares. Everyone who worked at Harrison and Cole became an owner of Harrison and Cole. The announcement was at the annual company meeting, in a hotel ballroom with all 150 employees gathered for what they thought was the usual state of the company presentation. I walked them through our 10-year journey first, showed them where we'd started, the numbers from the year before I took over, when Margaret was still CEO. Showed them where we were now, revenue up 300%, client base expanded from 400 to 1,800, assets under management grown from 2.3 billion to 8.7 billion. These numbers represent our collective success, I said. Not mine, I didn't do this alone. Every person in this room contributed to building Harrison and Cole into what it is today. And I think it's time that contribution was recognized with more than just salary and bonuses. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the new ownership structure. Effective immediately, 49% of Harrison and Cole is being distributed to employees as shares. You're not just working for this company anymore. You own it. You'll receive dividends based on profitability. You'll have a say in major strategic decisions. You'll benefit directly from our continued success. The silence that followed was profound. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then the whole room was applauding, some people standing, and I saw Sandra in the front row with tears in her eyes. After the meeting, people came up to thank me, to shake my hand, to express shock and gratitude. Patricia hugged me, which was the first time in 5 years she'd shown that kind of emotion. You didn't have to do this, she said. Yes, I did, I said. This company was built by all of us. It should belong to all of us. Later that night, Rachel and I sat on our balcony overlooking the city, drinking wine and watching the lights come on as evening settled. You gave away half your company today, Rachel said. I shared half my company, I corrected. There's a difference. Are you sure about this? You could have sold it for hundreds of millions. You could have kept all the equity and all the control. I could have been Margaret, I interrupted gently, hoarding power, seeing people as resources, measuring success purely in dollars. But I learned a long time ago that's not the kind of success I want. What kind do you want? I thought about it, thought about the past 10 years, about everything I'd learned and built and become. The kind where I can look at what I've created and feel proud, I said. Not just financially proud, but morally proud. The kind where the people who work with me feel valued and respected. The kind where when I'm gone, the thing I built continues because it's bigger than just me. That's a good kind of success, Rachel said, and kissed me. 12 years after the acquisition, I got another email from Margaret Harrison to John Harrison. Subject, thank you, John. I'm writing because I read about Harrison and Cole becoming employee-owned, and I wanted to reach out. I've been CEO of Harrison Consulting for 6 years now. Yes, I kept the family name for the firm. Some things are hard to let go of. I've tried to implement many of the things we talked about in that coffee shop. Distributed leadership, accountability structures, treating people as humans rather than resources. It's been hard work, but rewarding. Reading about what you've done with employee ownership made me realize how far you've come from the man I was married to. Or maybe you were always this person, and I just never bothered to see it. I wasted 10 years of your life because I was too insecure and too ambitious to appreciate what I had. I know I've apologized before, but I wanted to say it again. I'm sorry. You deserve better than what I gave you. I also wanted to say thank you for not destroying me when you could have, for giving me advice when I needed it, for showing me that there's a different way to lead, a different way to measure success. I'll probably never be as good a leader as you've become, but I'm trying, and that's because of the example you set. I hope you're happy, John. I hope you and Rachel are building a beautiful life together. I hope Harrison and Cole continues to thrive. You've earned all of it, with genuine respect and gratitude. Margaret, I read the email twice, then showed it to Rachel. How do you feel? She asked. Satisfied, I said. Not vindicated, exactly, just satisfied. She learned something. She changed. That's all you can hope for from people who've wronged you. Are you going to respond? I thought about it, thought about Margaret, now leading her own company, trying to be better, carrying the lessons she'd learned from destroying our marriage and our partnership. I wrote back, Margaret, thank you for the email. I'm glad to hear Harrison Consulting is doing well and that you're finding your own path to meaningful leadership. The past is the past. We were both different people then, and we've both grown since. I wish you continued success and happiness. Take care, John. Short, cordial, final. I hit send and closed my laptop. Is that it? Rachel asked. The end of the Margaret chapter? I think it's been over for a long time, I said. This was just the epilogue. 15 years after I bought Harrison and Cole Financial Services to prevent my wife from firing me, I stood in the same office where Margaret had once called me in with a smirk, where she'd told me I'd be training my replacement, where she'd had no idea that I'd seen her emails and spent 3 weeks quietly acquiring her company. The office looked different now. I'd redecorated, softened the corporate severity with personal touches. Photos of Rachel and our kids, artwork from local artists, bookshelves filled with the novels I finally had time to read. The mahogany desk was gone, replaced with a standing desk and a comfortable chair. The windows still offered the same view of the city, but I learned to actually look at it instead of just using it as a backdrop for power plays. I was 62 years old, Rachel was 58, our daughter was starting college, our son was in high school. Harrison and Cole had 300 employees, $15 billion in assets under management, and a reputation as one of the best places to work in the financial services industry. I was tired, not the bad kind of tired, the burnout exhaustion of someone who's been grinding themselves into dust, just the good kind of tired that comes from building something meaningful and realizing it's time to let other people carry it forward. So I called a meeting with the senior leadership team, Sandra, now co-CEO along with a brilliant strategist named Marcus Chen, no relation to Richard, my lawyer, though the coincidence had caused some confusion over the years. Patricia, who'd evolved from executive assistant to chief operating officer, and 3 other executives who'd been with the company for most of the past 15 years. I'm retiring, I told them. Sandra smiled like she'd been expecting this. When? End of the year, 6 months from now. That should be enough time for a smooth transition. You're sure? Marcus asked. The company is doing great. You could keep doing this for another 10 years if you wanted. I could, I agreed. But I don't want to. I want to travel with Rachel. I want to watch my kids grow up without constantly being distracted by work. I want to read books that have nothing to do with finance and learn to paint and maybe volunteer at the community center. I want to be a person instead of just a CEO. That's fair, Sandra said. And honestly, the company is structured to survive without you. That's what you built. Something sustainable, not dependent on any one person. That was always the goal, I said. We spent the next several weeks planning the transition. The employee ownership structure meant there was no single person taking over. Instead, leadership would be distributed among the senior team, with Sandra and Marcus as co-CEOs handling strategic direction, while Patricia managed operations. It was messy and complicated and thoroughly democratic, exactly the kind of structure that would have made Margaret crazy, but that I thought was perfect. My retirement party was held on a Friday evening in November, 15 years and 1 month after the breakfast meeting where I'd revealed to Margaret and Connor that I owned the company. The party was at the office, not at some fancy venue. We'd transformed the main floor into a celebration space, with food and drinks and a slideshow running on the big screens showing the company's evolution over the past 15 years. There were speeches, Sandra talked about how I'd promoted her from analyst to CFO and taught her that leadership was about service. Marcus talked about how I'd created a culture where people could do their best work without sacrificing their humanity. Patricia talked about how I'd shown her that efficiency and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. Then they presented me with a gift, a bound book containing messages from every single employee at Harrison & Cole thanking me for specific things I'd done, lessons I'd taught, moments I'd made a difference. I read through it later that night, sitting in my soon-to-be former office, and I cried. Not sad tears, just the overwhelming emotion of realizing that I'd done something good, something that mattered, something that would outlast me. On my last day of work, I came in early, before anyone else arrived. I sat at my desk and looked around the office one final time. Thought about the journey that had started with betrayal and ended with meaning. Thought about Margaret, wherever she was, hopefully doing well and being better. Thought about Connor Page, running his successful startup in San Francisco. Thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with mine over these 15 years. Thought about the man I'd been when I'd walked into this office to meet with my wife and learned I'd be training my replacement. That man had been smart, but passive, accommodating, willing to accept whatever role others assigned to him. He'd believed that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, that marriage meant partnership, that people generally acted in good faith. He'd been wrong about all of that. But in being wrong, in being betrayed, in being pushed to the edge of destruction, he'd discovered something valuable. He was capable of more than he'd ever imagined, capable of executing a complex plan with perfect patience, capable of building something meaningful, capable of being not just successful, but good. I'd learned that revenge didn't have to be destructive. It could be constructive. The best revenge wasn't destroying the person who wronged you. It was becoming so much more than they thought you could be that their opinions ceased to matter. I'd learned that power wasn't about controlling others. It was about creating conditions where everyone could thrive. I'd learned that success wasn't measured purely in money or status. It was measured in the quality of what you built, the lives you touched, the difference you made. These were hard lessons, learned through pain and struggle and long nights questioning everything. But they were worth learning. My phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. "How's the last day going?" "Good," I typed back, reflective, ready to move on. "I love you," she sent. "Come home soon. We're starting our new adventure." I smiled, gathered my personal items. There weren't many. I'd been slowly moving things out for weeks, and took one last look around the office. "Thank you," I said to the empty room, to the ghost of my former self, to Margaret and her betrayal, which had inadvertently set me free, to the universe that had given me a second chance and the wisdom to use it well. Then I turned off the lights and walked out, leaving Harrison & Cole Financial Services in the capable hands of the people I'd trusted, trained, and empowered. I was done being CEO. I was ready to just be John. 6 months into retirement, I was having coffee with Richard Chen, my lawyer and old friend, the man who'd helped me buy a company in 3 weeks when I was desperate and angry and determined. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked. "The acquisition, I mean. It cost you your marriage, consumed years of your life, put you under enormous stress. Was it worth it?" I thought about the question. Really thought about it. "Margaret and I would have gotten divorced anyway," I said. "We were fundamentally incompatible, heading in different directions, holding on to something that had stopped working years before. The acquisition just accelerated the inevitable. But you could have walked away, filed for divorce, taken your trust fund, started fresh somewhere else. Instead, you bought a company and spent 15 years running it. That's a heavy price to pay for not being fired." "I didn't buy the company to avoid being fired," I said. "I bought it because I was tired of being underestimated, tired of being seen as less than I was, tired of accommodating and compromising and making myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be." So it was about pride. It was about self-respect, I corrected, about refusing to let someone else define my worth or determine my future, about taking control of my own life in the most dramatic way possible. "And was it worth it?" Richard pressed. I thought about Sandra and Marcus running Harrison & Cole with the values I'd instilled. Thought about the 300 employees who owned shares in a company they'd helped build. Thought about the clients who received excellent service and the culture we'd created where people could do meaningful work without sacrificing their humanity. Thought about Rachel and our kids and the life we'd built together. Thought about who I'd become in the process of building all of this. Stronger, wiser, more complete. Yes, I said, it was absolutely worth it. Richard raised his coffee cup. To revenge well executed. I raised mine. To building something better. We clinked cups, and I thought about Margaret's smirk that day in her office when she told me I'd be training my replacement and believed I had no idea what was coming. She'd been so sure I was weak, so certain I'd accept whatever she decided for me. She'd been wrong. And in being wrong, she'd given me the greatest gift imaginable. The motivation to discover exactly what I was capable of when I stopped accepting other people's limitations. The rain started then. Just a light drizzle, the kind that makes the city look soft and forgiving, the kind that washes things clean. I watched it fall and felt nothing but gratitude for the betrayal that had freed me, for the anger that had focused me, for the 3 weeks I'd spent quietly buying a company while my wife planned my destruction, for the 15 years I'd spent building something meaningful from the wreckage of my marriage, for the quiet triumph of proving that dead weight could fly. The story could have ended differently, could have ended with me fired and divorced and broken, struggling to rebuild a career at 40 while my ex-wife moved on with her boyfriend and my job. Instead, it ended with me retired and happy, leaving behind a thriving company and a legacy of good leadership, married to someone who saw my worth from the beginning, watching my children grow up in a home filled with love instead of silent resentment. All because I'd spent 3 weeks, 15 years ago, refusing to accept the ending Margaret had written for me. All because I'd decided to write my own ending instead. And what an ending it was. They say living well is the best revenge. But I learned something better. Building well is the best revenge. Building a company that thrives. Building relationships based on respect. Building a life that reflects your values. Building yourself into someone stronger and wiser and better than anyone thought you could be. That's the kind of revenge that lasts. That's the kind of revenge that heals. That's the kind of revenge that, in the end, stops being about revenge at all and becomes about something bigger. Becoming the person you were always meant to be, if only someone would cease standing in your way. Margaret stood in my way for 10 years. So I bought her company, proved my worth, and moved on. And in doing so, I learned that the opposite of being deadweight isn't being powerful. It's being free. 15 years after my wife planned to fire me, I stood on a beach in Maine watching the sunrise, the same beach where Rachel and I had gotten married, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From betrayal to acquisition, from anger to purpose, from being someone's obstacle to being someone's example. The water was cold, the sand was wet, and the sky was doing that thing where it transitions from night to day, darkness dissolving into light. I thought about Margaret's email. He'll believe it right up until security is escorting him out. I thought about my response. Buying her company in 3 weeks. I thought about everything that had happened since. And I smiled. Because the best revenge isn't destruction. It's transformation. And I had transformed completely. From deadweight to CEO, from victim to victor, from someone who let others define him to someone who defined himself. The sun broke the horizon, spilling gold across the water. Tomorrow would be interesting, I'd thought 15 years ago, sitting at my desk with Margaret's offer to promote me and my secret knowledge of what was really happening. I'd been right. Tomorrow had been very interesting indeed, and so had every day since.